Hi, I'm Susan Nash, AAPG. Really happy to introduce you today to Laura Capper, Energy Makers Advisory Group. Welcome.
Hi, Susan. Nice to be here.
So I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about your recent research on capacity of disposal wells. What are some of your findings?
Sure. So Energy Makers has been analyzing the disposal well space for about 7 years. And starting about 5 years ago, we started doing these pressure studies where we try to figure out what the true constraints are for operating disposal wells in the area. And it's helpful to know a little bit about how these things are regulated. Typically, anybody running a disposal well has to submit a monthly report to the regulator organization showing what their surface pressures were and their volumes. And so it's not a big leap of faith to say, okay, if they allowed me, say, 10,000 barrels, and I'm achieving maybe 8,000 barrels of that, I'm getting 80% utilization. I'm using 80% of the capacity of that well. So that's what we like to look at, is how much of that disposal well capacity is there and really available to us. And this quick check we did on the health of New Mexico wells looks at Eddy and Lee County. And we first just looked at volumetric utilization. How much on the volume permit are these companies using? And this itself was interesting to me because what I'm showing you are only the new deep wells. So this is brand new capacity that just came on board over the last 2 or 3 years, really. And had I shown you this a couple of years ago, I would have shown you only about 20% utilization of those volumes for the wells that will be available. What you see here is that we've got considerably more water in the whole region that is up next to the border, possibly close to Texas. So much higher volumes in general next to the border. And then if you look at the green bar, that's showing you that you've got just shy of 9,000 barrels per day going in these deep wells. Again, the volume per well is much, much higher close to the border than you see up a little further north. And then what we think is very important is how much runway have you got on that volume permit? And that number has gone up pretty substantially in the last couple of years, from around 20 to 22%. To what you're seeing today, between 55 and 64% for those deep wells in the border. And it's important to appreciate that it's those deep wells in the New Mexico border that we really believe would bring us most of the new capacity. Now I'll take you to another domain now, and I find this even more interesting. Really, anybody that can do the right math can look at what your utilization is for volumes or surface pressures. It's publicly available information. There's a certain way you have to analyze the data to do it right, but it's doable. What my group specializes in is taking those reported surface pressures and from that extrapolating what the equivalent bottom hole pressures would have been to make that surface pressure. So if you think about it, what the regulators are really trying to police, if you will, is your formation activity. They don't want those bottom hole pressures to get too high. They just set your dials from the surface, right? So here we looked at volume utilization versus surface pressure utilization, which is really the only two things being regulated and looked at closely by the regulator. But for many of our clients, they want to know whether they've got 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years operating capacity on their disposal wells. So for a more rigorous look at the real capacity, we like to look at this effective bottom hole pressure utilization. And what you see here is that while we're well under our volume constraints, only 30%, maybe to 50 to 65% on volume, most of these wells are never going to see those volumes because they're already showing the regulated component surface pressure, and we're using in this case as much as say 58 to 60% in Eddy County. So you're probably not going to double the amount of water you're going to be able to put in that well because you're going to run into that surface pressure limitation first. But you can probably see where I'm headed with this, Susan. What the real punchline is that surface pressure is just an estimate of what's going on with your bottom hole pressure. when we try to take a close look at that versus the regulatory limits set, what you see is we're using upwards of 80% in most cases of the bottom hole pressure equivalent to what the permit is. So what my group would advise you is you might have, 15 or 20% runway left on these wells, but nowhere near what is implied if you just look at your volume permit or your surface pressure utilization. You really have to check further and see what's going on in the formation. So lots of implications about how much additional produced water we can get into these deep wells in New Mexico. I just don't think it's as much capacity as frankly the industry really needs. So this is what is really going to push the market for recycling, is we just can't continue to put it down the disposal well.
Oh, that's so insightful. And I know a lot of people will say, well, energy transition, we're going to phase out of oil and gas, doesn't matter. But I mean, if you look at the IEA report, they're saying basically stop long-term kind of elephant hunting. Anything that's already in place is going to be utilized, and probably more so, say in the Permian Basin.
Yeah. And New Mexico in particular, they're beautiful wells, they're attractive economically. Frankly, the only constraint we have in the area is natural resources in the terms of fresh water.
Yes.
And so all of our programs have got to be really pinpointed on alleviating that resource and doing something different, which we can do. So it's doable.
Right. And it's good to see that there's an incentive now to recycle and potentially reuse. What do you think is the most economic approach right now for recycling?
Oh, it's always a local dilemma, and you have to optimize locally. So you've got to look, do you have any disposal capacity? Frankly, is there anybody else that will take your water, maybe that you can swap water with if possible? And then your completion program. So it's just a day-to-day balancing act. But the good news is it's becoming very transparent what qualities of water we're using. That's now public information in New Mexico, whether we're fracking with fresh water or a brackish water. And so there's huge ESG incentives for operators to move quickly to recycling. And really, I've spoken with each of the very largest. There are no technical barriers to using 100% produced water for a frac. It might be a little more finicky or a little more complicated, but it's certainly doable. And most people are heading there very, very quickly from what I can see, at a much faster pace than we've seen in the last 5 years.
That's really good to know. Well, thank you, Laura. This is a great overview, and just look forward to reading more about your work and learning more.
We intend to post more. Thank you.
Thank you.